Yeah. If you have any issues, like technical issues, I would prefer it if you communicate. Like if you're having unstable network, everything like that. Also adhere to how people prefer to take points of information. Make it a habit of asking or telling the house before you start speaking how you want to take points of information. So at this point in time, my name is Maria Makelve, and I'll be the chair for this round. Izunna, can you please introduce yourself before we start this round? Panelists?
Hi, my name is Izunna, and I would be your panelist for this round.
Okay, thank you very much. I am hoping that everyone has the same motion, which has to do with adulthood, if I'm not mistaken. With that then being said, without further ado, we would like to call upon the Prime Minister to start off this debate. Izunna, if you do not mind, please could you do timing in the chat space? Izunna? Judge Izunna, do you mind doing timing?
Hello.
I think he
Hello.
got kicked out.
I'm audible.
Hi, how are you? Yes, you are audible. I'm gonna try and do timing, but I prefer
Sure.
if you guys also try and do those on your
Sure.
end.
Prosper is going to give the Prime Minister's speech, and he's
Pardon?
trying to connect to the Zoom call. So Prosper is going to give the Prime Minister's speech, and he's connecting to the Zoom call. I think he will start immediately he joins. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I'll give you 2 minutes, please. Just 2 minutes. If they're not here, we will proceed, and you will have to iron, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Hi, Prosper Michael.
Okay, is Prosper Michael the opening government?
I think so. I don't know.
Wow.
I'm.
Wow.
Oh my God. I know we are gone. Oh yeah, we are OG here. So I guess I'm going to be PM.
Okay. So with that then being said, please could we have just the normal house rules? Please can we just indicate our preferred pronouns, how we prefer to be taking points of information. Izunna, please could you time for us, Judge? Can you time for us? Ready when you're ready, PM.
All right, thank you very much. So again, my name is Prosper Michael. I'll take my POIs in the chat. Please do not interrupt me. I would be generous enough to take a POI from both sides if I can, but I would prioritize POIs from closing opposition to facilitate a long diagonal. All right. Fear that comes with becoming of age. There is a concept that's always attached to adulthood, and that concept largely defines what people should believe adulthood should be. It equally defines how people should conduct themselves. It creates the idea that adulthood is a status, and as it is a status, it equally comes with certain demands and certain roles individuals should play in a bid to satisfy that status. From our side as opening governments, we think that the concept of adulthood is not only bad, but is one that should particularly be regretted. Like the glorification of that concept should be regretted to like mitigate any trauma that is going to come from like the upside. We think that the conversation as to whether or not the concept of adulthood is a great one. It's one that is like inconclusive in of itself. So we could give a solid defense as to why we think the concept of adulthood is bad in of itself. We could actually have that debate. However, we think that that's inconsequential because the question in today's debate is whether or not glorification of said concept is what is good for society in that regard. In my speech, I'm going to be doing three things. First off, I'm going to analyze to exactly what the concept of adulthood looks like. Secondly, I'm going to point out to you exactly what the glorification of said concept looks like and how it creates a pervasive demand for individuals to satisfy. And thirdly, I'll show you why that glorification has created more harm than good within societies and how it has largely glass-clipped a lot of individuals and stripped them of happiness and childhood glee. First line of characterization. We think that the concept of adulthood largely in many societies looks like particularly becoming of age, and becoming of age equally comes with certain demands like being expected to marry, being expected to own certain things, being expected to have your life figured out. We think that the concept of adulthood to a large degree is one that is always revolving around the yeah.
I think I lost you at some point. I think I lost you. When you're talking
Can you hear
about
me?
at the point of adulthood, I heard I missed you at the point of adulthood. At the point of adulthood.
What was the last phrase you heard?
At the point of adulthood.
Okay, sure. Is it any better now?
Yeah. I'll just
All
tell
right,
you
great.
if I lose you.
All right, sure. All right, and I hope my lost time is going to be accounted for, by the way. So I'll be continuing in 3, 2, 1. We think that at the age of adulthood, the idea is that you should have your life figured out to a certain extent. And again, I'm going to be preventing any straw money that's going to come from the upside, because they could probably come and say that, well, they don't expect you to fully have your life figured out. Like, that's not a debate. To a certain extent, society expects you to have a reasonable portion of your life figured out. They expect you to have outlined goals. They expect you to have satisfied those goals to a reasonable extent. They expect you to be reasonably fulfilled. They expect you to be married or like be working towards getting married. They expect you to act in a certain manner in social settings, which particularly look like not particularly being playful, taking everything seriously, and being so stone cold and goal oriented. Why is this particularly troublesome? We think that this in of itself is not something that is bad as a moral element. It's not something that is bad as a value that society casts upon individuals.
I don't know if it's my end, but is anyone hearing Prosper? I'm sorry, guys. Can somebody tell me if you can hear
I can't
me?
hear him too. I can't hear him.
I can't hear him.
Okay. You know what? Let me try and see. Prosper, do you mind exiting and coming back in?
Sure.
Because I you keep on breaking. But if it persists, I think we're going to just ask if it's possible for us to head to Discord, because I think maybe the data consumption is a bit higher this side. So please just exit and then come back in. Then we can see if it improves. Thank you very much.
Hi, can you hear me now? Is it better now?
Yeah, it is better. But I think it's better for you to start from the top because it keeps on
All right,
breaking.
sure.
But just give me a minute to confirm because also my panelist is continuously getting kicked out. So I'm just gonna try and see what can be done. Is he going to join me, or I'm going to have to look for an alternative means? Maybe we can join a Discord channel. So just give me a minute, please, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, guys. Just give me a minute. Okay,
Hello.
guys, I'm
Okay.
so sorry. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm having two issues. Prosper, you breaking, and the judge keeps on getting kicked out because I think his network is unstable. So I'm gonna ask this through. I'm gonna give you guys the liberty to know. Is it people's network stable? Are you guys having network stability so we can continue? Maybe I'll judge alone, or you guys want to switch to Discord? I prefer it if people just tell me their concerns so I can continue with this debate.
For OG, I think like our network is okay. I was just using the Wi-Fi, but I've stretched it off. I'm using cellular data, and that's fine for me.
Okay. Okay. I see someone say, oh, is saying they have network is stable. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna assume everyone is okay with this. Then we can start from the top, and you guys we can definitely do with just myself judging this round. Is that okay with you guys?
Yes, please.
Okay, so start from the top, please. Just start from the top because I didn't really.
So I'll be starting my speech all over.
Okay, please also do time yourself because I'm gonna be trying to time on my end, but it's preferred if you also time yourself.
Sure thing, no problem.
Ready when you're ready. Ready when you're ready.
All right, so I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So panel, for the purpose of today's debate, I'm going to be doing a number of things. I'll be doing 3 things in particular. First off, I'll be explaining to you what exactly the concept of adulthood looks like. Secondly, I'll be showing you why the glorification of that concept in of itself is bad. Recognize that in today's debate, we have 2 options aside governments. We could particularly say We don't like the glorification of the concept because the concept in of itself is bad. And alternatively, we could agree that there's a certain level of good that comes off of the concept. But regardless, we still think its glorification has created a pervasive environment that strips people of certain fundamental rights and fundamental freedoms, so much so that we still think that glorification makes it a bad thing in of itself. Yeah. And the last thing I'm going to be doing again in this debate is to show you exactly why it is so. So first thing we need to understand is like the concept of adulthood in of itself. We think that in many societies there's a multiplicity of what adulthood looks like. But generally, the underpinning element of adulthood in every society is that adulthood has certain facets. One, it is assumed to be the time of your life where you are believed to have come of age, so much so that you are expected to be able to take responsibility. One. Two, you're expected to be able to lead your life in a certain direction that is desirable, not only to yourself, but also to the societal understanding and the societal standard that has been established by those before you. Secondly, we think that it also looks like a time the concept of adulthood also looks like a time in your life where you are expected to satisfy certain roles that have been ascribed by society. We think sometimes these roles look like becoming a married man. Do you think that sometimes these roles equally look like particularly being able to pay your own bills, not being dependent on family, particularly being self-sufficient, or to a certain extent, like being able to even take care of other people outside of yourself? We think that the concept of adulthood largely revolves around these things. We think the third thing that the concept of adulthood also revolves around, like equally boils down to how you behave yourself or how you portray yourself in social settings. We think that for many societies, when you're considered to be an adult, the idea is that you're supposed to exercise a certain level of decorum and you're supposed to act in a certain manner in social settings. So for example, you're not expected to be joking around or to be playing around with kids when you're in a social setting. You're expected to be with your peers. You're expected to have a prim and proper outlook to things, and particularly to sacrifice things that are considered childish. So for example, my father is constantly complaining as to why I go for debate tournaments at the age of 23 when he thinks that I should rather be going for seminars about how to better build up my startup. We think that these are things that the concept of adulthood looks like. We think that from side opening governments, we can concede that the intentions behind the concept of adulthood are good, because more often than not, society does not wish to damn us to a sad and to a thankless, sad life. However, it equally does not necessarily mean that in the manifestation of this intention, we particularly have a happy life in that regard. What does this mean? This means that to a large degree, it could be argued from up that, well, all these things are nice things that everyone should aspire to. They think that these are things that's like are okay and they are great. However, from side gap, we think that even if we concede and we bite the bullet to say that, well, these are nice things that people should aspire to, we still think that nice things should not be forced down the throats of people, and would show you how glorification does that. But more importantly, what does this glorification look like? We think glorification comes in certain forms. One, it looks like particularly creating a social setting that compels individuals of a certain age to act in that manner, to act in the manner where people believe that this is what adulthood looks like. We think that looks like, it looks like, secondly, glorifying the idea of all these facets or all these descriptions I've given to you to children when they are even becoming of age, so much so that they assume that this is the only way to go about their lives. We think it equally looks like particularly chastising or castigating individuals who act counter to any of these things that have been prescribed by society. Why is this particularly bad as a form of glorification? We think that in of itself, it strips individuals of the liberty and the freedom to be able to fully express themselves without particularly kowtowing to societal dictates in that regard. We think what this means is that constantly individuals are supposed to act a certain script out to society, so society is going to give them social tokens. We think individuals in that regard are stripped of the opportunity to act to their fullest capacity, to the fullest capacity of their ability to express themselves. But why is expression particularly monumental in today's debate? Because we think that to fully satisfy yourself as an individual, devoid of societal pressure, it means that you need to be able to fully express yourself in a manner that you deem fit. We think what the glorification of the concept of adulthood has done is that it has cast a blanket description of what every person of age should be like and how they should act like. We think that is bad because it strips individuals of that opportunity to act in any manner they choose. But more importantly, this is like, and recognize this is a mitigatory argument. We don't think that today's debate in any way like delves into things that cause harm to individuals. So up cannot say that, well, like if the concept of adulthood is not glorified, individuals are going to particularly go on a killing spree or do harmful things to individuals, saying that's outside of the debate. But more importantly, we think that the debate hinges on a fulcrum. That's when you constantly feed people a rhetoric that this is only what you are allowed to do. This is the boundary within which you are supposed to operate. So much so that they do not have any opportunity to operate within it. We think that in of itself is bankrupt. We think that social engineering that is done by society to individuals strips them of the ability to fully express themselves and be happy. We think that the decisions that is made by society as to what defines happiness strips individuals of the peculiarities that exist, so much so that individuals particularly cannot engage within these peculiarities in of itself. But more importantly, we think that the overglorification of things like money, overglorification of things like marriage, strip individuals who are slowly entering into adulthood of the opportunity to focus on other aspects of their lives that they want to focus on. We think what this means then is that these people are condemned to constantly satisfy a certain role or certain sociologically created framework by society, so much so that they do not get the opportunity to sit down and dictate for themselves. The problem in today's debate is the blanket policy created by society. We think that is bad and individuals should be allowed to be peculiar. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Speaker, for that speech. We now call upon the leader of opposition. Izunna, are you timing? Or should I?
Maria.
Yes.
This is possible. If it won't be a bother, I would like to use my personal things continue with the round. I'm at work, so I have to get back to it.
It's all right. Not a problem.
Thank you.
I would like to call upon the leader of opposition. Hello?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Prosper, please, can you mute your mic? Okay. Ready when you're ready.
Okay, so for the sake of your eyes, just raise a hand. Yeah, like if you raise a hand, I'm going to take you. But please, if by my 5th minute, I've not yet taken a POI, you can unmute yourself, yeah, and interrupt my speech. I'd prioritize one for closing government for the sake of the short diagonal engagement. So with that said, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So panel, you need to understand firstly that a key dichotomy in itself exists between the concept of adulthood in itself and the glorification of the concept in itself. So what it looks like is that in like humanity, or like just based on the cycle of humanity, the way nature in itself designed it, humans in themselves go through 3 stages of development. Vis-a-vis, one, first of all, becomes a child. From becoming a child, that particular person now grows up, becomes an adult, and then eventually becomes old and dies. The reason why this in itself is particularly important, particularly in the context of today's debate in itself, is that we think that today's debate in itself is one that primarily focuses on a regret of the glorification, or whether or not we should regret the glorification of this particular concept or not. We don't necessarily think that this particular debate should be hinged on the whole line of whether or not the concept of adulthood in itself is one that is bad or good. The reason why, and this is why Capin himself do not put the motion as this has regrets the concept of adulthood, is because adulthood in itself is inevitable, meaning all of this stuff like societal pressures, etc., that Prosper tries to tell you in this speech are things that you would get irrespective of the glorification of adulthood. The reason why this is true is because as at the concept or as at the start of adulthood, what happens or what differentiates adulthood from the previous, like, stage of development, being childhood and the rest of that, is because primarily this particular stage of life is the stage of life where a particular individual gets independence, meaning this particular child in itself or this particular person in himself now has, like, lots and lots of things to effectively do. In most of the instances, this particular person is literally sent into the world, and this particular person is now the one that is facing the world square on. Understand how, to the extent where this is true in itself, it means that this particular person, like, naturally, with or without the glorification in itself, faces all of these different pressures that societies in them or the society in themselves would like throw to this particular person. It is totally different from the glorification. And this is our stance in today's debate, because we think from our position, we could generally take two stances. One is that we could effectively decide to show you how the concept of adulthood in itself is one that is particularly good, hence the glorification of it now becomes one that is particularly good. Or we could even concede that the concept of adulthood in itself might be bad, but then the glorification of it in itself is one that is good. How so? We think even if, and this is an even if, like, in the level of analysis, even if we want to conceive, like, even if we want to, like, concede to all of, like, Prosper's analysis of how, like, of how the concept of adulthood in itself is bad, we think that the glorification in itself is one that is good. Why? Because we think that what it does is that it better helps people in themselves to be able to cope with all of these challenges that adulthood in themselves or that adulthood in itself brings. So what it looks like is that the glorification of adulthood looks like people generally hyping or generally talking about, like, this particular concept more, saying how this particular, like, stage of life in itself is one that is particularly very, very important. And so it requires what, like, it's a stage that generally requires people to generally, be more focused on it and generally, like, take care, especially as it relates to their approach to this particular, like, stage of life. We think what this glorification in itself does is that it now sends a kind of narrative that we think is very, very beneficial to each and every individual, a narrative of an increased sense of responsibility, particularly within this particular stage of life. So what it looks like is that individuals naturally, because of this level of glorification, now begin to get a more nuanced and, like, a more focused approach, especially as it relates to how they generally approach, like, this particular stage of life. This particular narrative that generally sends, or this particular sense of responsibility, or this particular increased sense of importance that generally plays, now means that these particular guys in themselves are now better able to cater for all of the stress that comes, like, with all of the challenges in themselves that comes with adulthood. So what it then looks like is that even if we concede that all of these things like pressures, etc., that these guys in themselves talk about in itself is one that is particularly bad, we think that the glorification in itself is one that better helps individuals in the period of society to be able to handle it. This now becomes particularly important. Why? Because what it then looks like is that without the glorification of this particular concept, people in themselves will treat this particular stage of life same way that they treat, like, or with a lesser sense of responsibility than they would have in a world where this particular glorification looks like. So what it looks like is that they are now, like, less, they are now less, like, what is it called? They are now less equipped, one, or two, they now have, like, they now approach this particular stage of life with less vim, especially as it relates to their relationship with this particular stage of life. The rundown impact of this particular analysis now looks like them, because this is a comparative. It then looks like them now being increasingly likely to buckle under the pressures that generally comes with adulthood. We think that this particular, like, this particular, like, glorification in itself is what generally improves, like, that hypes this particular stuff in itself and generally increases, like, the approach or the level of caution and carefulness and focus that people generally, like, take, especially as it relates to the approach to this particular stage of life. Tobi, make it good.
See, just my POI is which mechanism give this adulthood hype? Like, what mechanism gives the hype that you deserve in this adulthood?
I didn't quite get the POI, but I don't know whether you are saying what mechanism gives the hype. I don't necessarily think that there's any need for us to start going through the mechanism of glorification. We not think that that's the debate. The debate does not say this house will glorify, like, adulthood or something like that. We think many mechanisms in themselves already exist in the purview of status quo, vis-a-vis, like, indoctrination that generally exists already, or vis-a-vis, like, things like social media and the rest of that. But we don't necessarily think that the mechanism in itself is one that is particularly important. The question in the debate still remains, is it justified, or does it make sense for us to regret the glorification of this particular concept or not? We move. understand how this in itself, as I pointed out, and this comes as a direct clash to the level of points that we get from opposition in themselves or from government in themselves, generally now improves the ability of these individuals to act to their fullest ability. Because what it then looks like is that these individuals within the purview of society now, due to the fact that they have now taken a more nuanced approach to this particular stage of life, what then looks like is that now better able to apply, like, skills and the rest of them, or try to develop themselves in such a way where they are better able to cater for this particular stuff. But understand how prosper lies when it tells you that it strips individuals from choice and the rest of that. The reason why why that's a lie in itself is because the glorification does not necessarily say, oh, you must be a tech guy, or oh, you must be a doctor, or oh, you must be this and that. The glorification simply says, oh, there are certain responsibilities that make adulthood in itself very unique, particularly as a stage of life that determines usually who you'd become or how your life in itself will look spent. So at the end of the day, the particular individual still has a myriad of options as to how he or she would want to live his or her life. It's why society still glorifies successful debaters that are adults. They don't simply say, because of you're an adult, you cannot be a debater or the rest of them. But secondly, the whole concept of what adulthood in itself looks like goes beyond things like money, marriage, and the rest of that. Like, it goes beyond all of that. In places like United States of America, for crying out loud, nobody cares about whether you get married or whether you give birth. Like, so, okay. I thought it would be put in the text space. No problems. I'm cool.
Thank you very much, speaker, for that speech. We now call upon the DPM. And yes, the time was being put in the chat space. And I think you did have 1 minute left, but I was actually watching the timer and it was now 7 minutes, 15 seconds. So DPM, ready when you're ready.
Okay, hello, am I audible now?
Yes.
Hello, am I audible? Okay.
Yes, you are.
For POI, you raise your hand. If I'm not heard at any point in time, please let me know, and I'll just reconnect or position myself. Well, setting up my timer, and I'll begin as soon as it's done. Okay, so in 3, 2, 1. Prosper preempted the LO speech when he tells you that our problem from opening government in today's debate has to do with the expectations that is placed on adulthood and how the glorification entrenches it and prevents people from opting out of those particular expectations. The LO speech basically talks about this particular expectation, and he says that these expectations are normal. That's whole, his whole argument is this because of the society. What they are supposed to do to be able to counter prosper speech, which has not largely been engaged, is to be able to prove why that particular expectations placed on adults or placed on adulthood are one that is justified, and not to simply prove that it exists. Because Prosper considered that these things exist. What he told you is that is bad, and we do not need to have a system or a mechanism, which is the glorification, that entrenches it and forces it down people's throats. His response is that, well, these things are existent. You need to be able to defend these things and whether it is good that these particular pressures are existent. I'm going to be doing 3 things. 3 pieces of framing. Beyond that, I'm going to be engaging the matter you get from the leader of opposition, and then I'll give you my extension in today's debate. So on framing, the first thing is the typical idea, it's a regret debate, it's supposed to be a retrospective etc debate. Our argument is simple. To the extent where we regret the concept of adult as defined by the leader of opposition, it means that any attempt that has been made to be able to push this thing down the throats of people, to glorify it by principle, is something that we regret. But I'm further going to even play that game and show why retrospectively it has been bad for us, and that's going to be my extension. But on the principle level, we regret these particular expectations, we regret the concept of adulthood as being painted, and so any attempt to qualify it is something that is problematic. The second thing is that this debate is not really about the welfare for the aged, because those things can exist. We don't need to glorify the adulthood before we can have specific policies for them. Example is how we don't necessarily glorify being female female, but we have like niche policies or specific policies that ensure like the welfare of women are better off in that particular instance. We don't need to glorify adulthood because we can give like senior benefits or senior privileges to specific people. But then the third thing that you need to understand in today's debate is that the benefits that can be argued on the upside is also existent on our side, right? So for example, like people want to have a specific way of adult that they want to like push into or even opt into, and that is fine. But what we are against is having a societally accepted like or desirable concept of adulthood and glorifying such that people are pushed into it. But before, the last thing I'm going to characterize is the definition for glorification. So from the LO speech, you understand that his definition for glorification is to have a system where we have conversations on these things, so that we create a buffer for people to be able to opt into adulthood. First response that we don't even like that concept of adulthood, we regret it. The second response is that the definition, like that particular definition, is actually counters as actually like pegged up as opposed to the definition that you get from Prosper. So the definition that we like of glorification that we get from Prosper literally speaks into a world where we put systems in place to make sure that this particular traits are desirable. We put mechanisms to place to be able to sanction or even like make sure that people who do not opt into these particular things, right? These particular things feel bad, like the example that Prosper gave to you. The point is this: he gives no response. He just tries to give like another definition, which is we have a conversation on it. But in truth, the conversation is what makes these things like what's this particular like they harm that on our side. So it is the glorification that makes sure that we are telling people, that gives us the platform and avenue to tell people that this is what is right, this is what you must aspire to. The platform of talking does not give buffer to people to be able to withstand the pressures. It simply reinforces the pressures and tell people that this is what you are supposed to expect at this point in time. It's very terrible and like you should not buy into that particular thing. But what other things do they say? So they talk about how it gives people like a focused approach, gives people a sense of responsibility. Yeah, we don't care about those things. Those things are like very terrible pressures. We do not want to force people into it. You cannot say that let us force people into something and then give them a buffer to it. If it is bad, if you consider people deserve a buffer to it, that is why we say that then it means that it is terrible. You don't need to give a buffer. Let us regret this particular motion, and like that's insufficient to deal with what you get from them. So what then is my extension? I think to a larger extent, Prosper has been able to like establish the impact of these things on the people that are necessarily like moving into adulthood or the people that are considered as adults. My extension is going to prioritize like the divide that exists to the extent where you recognize that some people are adults and some people are children. So I'm going to be talking about like four main things in this particular instance. The first one is that it established a class system that gives the adult power, right? And so that's why they go through all what Prosper tells you, so that they are preparing them to be able to like have that particular power. But secondly, it means that it gives them like a sense of entitlement to this particular power. It gives them that particular responsibility to be able to socialize the youth, right? But the third thing that you need to get is that it means that we prioritize these particular people or these people who consider adults like for specific positions because we assume that these guys are the best people to lead us, right? Then the fourth problem is that it systematically locks out the youth from occupying this particular same position because we assume based on the pressures and based on like the buffer you talked about that the adult is better positioned or well suited for specific position. And this has so many impacts, right? So one, on leadership, it means that we have systematically locked out the youth and we tell them that the youth is the future. What happens is that you've put old men who does not necessarily understand the growing needs of a youthful population into systems of leadership when they constantly make decisions that are outmoded and not like suited to the current trends, but secondly, that does not prioritize the needs of the youth because they have like different understanding and they grow up in different circumstances like of the world. But the second problem that you need to consider, and why we regret this thing as a matter of retrospectiveness, is how it means that you have locked out the youth from being able to actively participate in the world that belongs to them, the world that is going to be for them. So at best, we have a world where like the agent like create this particular things for them. But the thirdly, also on how like because of the sense of entitlement, it means that the adults see this upon themselves, be able to socialize like the youth into like worlds that they envision for them, right? Not necessarily consulting them, and that's how come like change is necessarily slow to happen. And so anything that is anti-societal goals are deemed as something from the youth. So LGBTQ, like even how to be express yourself as a woman is deemed as something that's new, is now something that we are copying from the youth, and it's deemed as something that is anti-societal structures just because like a large majority of the adults that have power like necessarily do not buy into these things, and then the youth that we want to be expressive. I think this ties down the idea that we need to be able to have like a very responsible adult that is taking care of them and socializing them to the extent where we are locking the youth and preventing them from owning the world that they deserve to occupy like in the future. It's very terrible, and we regret this particular concept, right? But the most important that you need to consider is how like it's on the power dynamic. So we've given power to like very few people who came as adult and seasoned, because like Protas tells you, we look out like other adults that do not fit into the criteria we set for them, and then we've given them power to be able to like control the lives and the ability to express like the expressiveness of the youth, and so we are preventing them from being able to harness them, right? The point of our argument is simple, that to the extent where this has like undesirable impacts on the adults themselves because they're not able to cope in, and also on the youth that comes after them, and we regret this as a matter of principle and retrospectiveness. Proudly opening up.
Thank you, DPM, for that speech. Now call upon the DLO. Ready.
Can I get a few seconds? I just want to tidy up my notes. Thank you. All right, so I'm here. Since this is a recorded round, okay, I'll just give a shout out to my friends that say I should give a shout out to them. So Gochukwu and the entirety of the boardroom comrades. So yes, that being said, I'll be starting my speech. Sorry, please, let me just set my timer. All right, okay. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2. Panel, please just confirm you can hear me. I'm sorry, I forgot to do that checkup.
Yes, we can hear you. I can.
All right, okay, all right. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, notice that there is something that the opening government actually fails to consider in this debate. The debate particularly is not about whether or not adulthood has created, a kind of like harm or whatever, or whether or not adulthood is good in and of itself. But the debate is actually about whether or not it is justified to regret, the glorification of the concept of adulthood, right? And from the opening opposition, we boldly tell you that it is actually very, very justified, to support this glorification. That is, it is unjustified to regret it, right? And then, I'll just go ahead to actually, give you reasons why we say that, right? Firstly, what does my partner tell you? My partner tells you how, this glorification particularly happens. It happens through, a level of discourse, people talking about how, the adulthood is actually a very important stage of life. He also gives you, a dichotomy between childhood and adulthood, and why adulthood is actually characterized by a lot of independence that actually take place in that actually come about with adulthood, and how, it now comes out with a level of, expectations about, how you should actually react because of that level of independence, and because you actually do not have, to depend on authority anymore, right? And then a few responses to what opening government gives you before I go on, right? Opening government tell you about how this glorification establish, a classism and all that stuff, and how it's now, tells people what to do. My partner already, responds to that preemptively, especially when it tells you that glorification does not particularly, tell you what to do, right? It does not decide for you exactly what to do. What glorification tells you, right, is that adulthood is actually a stage of life that is very, very peculiar to your self-actualization as a human, particularly because in adulthood you get the level of freedom that you do not have in childhood. In adulthood, society presents to you a myriad of options, right? You are actually free to choose from whatever option that you actually have presently in society, right? Notice how in childhood, right, because you are a child, or because you're in that stage of childhood, on a comparative, as a dichotomy, right, in childhood, you're actually restricted from certain, benefits like, having to decide whether or not you can drive, or benefits like, actualizing in, voting and all that stuff, getting to decide the politics of society, right? But then in adulthood, you're actually like giving those kind of freedom and those kind of choices, right? So the glorification is actually something that, from opening opposition, we feel that, and we think, and we strongly believe that it's very, very necessary. If humans would be, or individuals would be able to, properly self-actualize. So the whole argument about, glorification, limiting the self-actualization of humans would not actually fly to this debate, particularly because glorification now helps you know exactly how to go about those, exactly the kind of choices that you get to, make within that particular stage of life, and, help your self-actualization. Please, if you have a POI, just like raise your hand, right? So, going further, right, like on the pragmatics, like just to impact many of what my partner already tells you, I'll just be doing the engagement in my speech, right? So on pragmatics, notice how like society generally has actually like evolved from time, right? We've come from the Stone Age to, the whatever age to where we are, right? And it's now for humans to constantly, experience the quality of life in which they need to experience over time. And because humans do not just stop like evolving, right? Humans evolve over time. It becomes very, very important to keep the progressiveness of society ongoing, right? Now, on a comparative, in a world where we actually like regret the glorification of adulthood, right? What we see is that adulthood is just presented to individuals without being necessarily like without that particular discourse being created about it, or without it generally being talked about amongst individuals, right? What you then see in that particular kind of world is a world where humans generally just move into adulthood without like knowing what to expect. Humans just move into adulthood without knowing the like peculiarities of adulthood, without knowing exactly how the adulthood comes with so much freedom, like in contrast to what they've actually experienced in the childhood phase, right? And like what impact do you see? Like what's the impact in society in their own world, in those worlds? What you then see is a world where humans generally, do not know how to respond to life problem, right? Because like in the childhood, right, you're actually dependent on authorities. You cannot like take, these certain decisions on your own. You've got to ask for advice. But then in the adulthood, you're actually expected to take that particular kind of advice and that particular kind of decisions on your own and independently, right? So what you then see, like on a comparative, right, what you now see in their own world is a situation where humans just move into the adulthood phase and they do not like, they're clearly, dumb strong, and like they do not know exactly what to expect, and how to move about it. But then like our own world actually like mitigate, those kind of confusions that actually come. And like I am like exactly that's what opening government tells you in their own word when they talk about the harms of adulthood and all that stuff, right? But then notice how like our own word even mitigates that harm, and like to the extent where it mitigates that harm, that is where we actually like make that. That's why we actually like justified to support this clarification, right? And like what mitigation are we talking about? That's what I'm about to show you right now, right? Now notice how like that in like on the like in our own word, right? What you see in our own world is a situation where humans, individuals already, because of this clarification, they already know that adulthood is a world where we get to we get a lot of freedom and all that stuff. I'll take it later. Just give me a sec. Adulthood is where you get freedom of choices and all that stuff, right? Then what you then see is them now. They now like when they now get into there, because they already know this is what they have to expect, right? They are not particularly put off or thrown off balance when they now face, these particular challenges. And this is something that is very, very important to society, because it now helps, keep the progressiveness of society. That is, it now creates rational thinkers in the society, because already, coming out of that dependent stage in the childhood, right? You already know that, this stage is actually like a stage where I'm particularly very, very independent, right? So what you then see is that these individuals now are like, they are now able to, better think for themselves, and now become rational thinkers, right? And be able to, make choices based on, the level of information that they have, which is something that is very, very key if society is actually going to progress from, what it is now to what is like it's going to be, right? Before I go on, who has a POI? Please shoot.
So we argue that, people have a self-natural instinct to self-preserve. So whoever wants to take on that,
out of order, please let me just conclude my this. So like on pragmatic, like so like generally impacting what I've been saying, right? This progressiveness of society actually, like, you know, is something that our world brings here, especially since our world, you know, kind of like gives you or our world consists of individuals who like become rational thinkers because of this self-glorification, of this glorification of adulthood, and how, you know, like our world, you know, makes this makes individuals particularly able to better self-actualize. Now, no, like I'm going to be ending my speech with this, right? In the two worlds, right? In a world, you have individuals where, you know, individuals who cannot actually, like, you know, make rational decisions in that particular adulthood because this glorification is absent. But in our own world, you kind of like, you know, have individuals who can make rational decisions because that glorification is present. So, like, as a question, right? Which world do you prefer? A world where society, you know, is actually like better because of the quality of individuals present in a world where society, like, you know, is at this detriment of going extinct. With this, very proud to oppose. Yeah.
Thank you, DLO, for that speech. And closing up the first half of the debate, we now come to the second half of the debate, and we call upon the member of government. Tell me when you're ready so I can start timing. I also advise that it's time for yourselves.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
This far, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I want to set a timer for myself, so I might not be looking at the chat space. Speakers should please unmute themselves for POIs. I'll take CO and OO. Yeah, I'll take CO and OO. Starting my speech in 3. Okay. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, 0. Panel, we think OO lie for you in today's debate when they tell you that over-glorification in their word means so much of discourse, and how these discourse are very, very important because this discourse would then further lead people to know or believe what adulthood are. We think this is blatant lie. 2 things why it's lie. 1, they did never extensively show us why that is important. They did not show us why from the transition of adulthood to any other wood, maybe the grown up or the old wood, why that in and of itself is why that in and of itself should be glorified too. We think at a point where they say this over glorification inherently means discourse, then they should extensively show us how this discourse takes place. And that is when I asked my POIs, who made this discourse? So we answer the question for them. We say this discourse are made by society in over glorification. What does over glorification looks like in our world panel? We think over glorification in our world means a period where society create a certain blanket, feed them in with what ideology of what adulthood should entail. It means, at 30, you have to be successful. At 25, you have to have your first car. We say those are the glorification of what adulthood is. What is the consequence? What are the consequences of this? So at 25, when you've not made your first 1 million naira, 3 things happen. 1, there is a huge call-out mechanism on social media when people flaunt what they have. It goes with when people say, I'm grateful for God, or there's an hashtag on at 30 on Twitter. You say at this point, people who already are successful at those points are now termed adults. Why others who are not successful are seen as people who are not serious with their life? We say that over glorification that this guy says cause for discourse really could not fit into the context of today's debate. And we think this particular framing or characterization or clarity from CG takes away the bulk of their cases, because that's the only thing they have in the debate. Conversation. Before we go for a positive matter, POI CO. 3, 2, 1, 0. POI.
Engage your
Hello.
All right. Yeah, go.
Okay, so understand how, like, at the end of the day, the mechanization of this particular stuff in itself is not something that we have to like necessarily go into, but this your mechanization itself is one that is false. Engage our case on how comes the glorification in itself is one that mitigates harm that come from this particular concept in itself.
Exactly, that's my problem with you. The arm you said can still exist because society are the one who put this pressure, and the glorification means discourse on social media, discourse in family meetings, discourse in school reunion. We say at a point where those discourse armed adults inherently and does not go cause progression, then that over glorification inherently is trash, and that is why you are out in this debate. What do we bring for you, panel? First, we are going to show you why inherently, how this creates time frame and the arm it has. So we think COG has done a lot in mechanization and principle justification. We are going to show on utility and benefit, why this over glorification further harms society, one. Secondly, further harms this adult themselves. So continue with the characterization I gave. So panel, we think adulthood or the over glorification of adulthood peg a certain age for success or put success on certain things. What that don't want is one, it does not allow people to be what they want to be. What do I mean by this? We say at a particular point in a conservative African background, where somebody wants to be a porn star as an adult, the first thing adulthood does to such person is they say, for you to be an adult, you must be of certain moral characteristics. Why is that bad? It neglects people who wants to self-actualize away. Secondly, is that people don't get, at that time, further entrenches people to be able to do something they want. So people go for other choices. It looks like at the point where they say, oh, adulthood is 25 or 18 to 50, and you've not established things that ought to be established. People go for huge things such as crime, and that is why there are rise in fraud in certain part of in Nigeria or certain part of Africa, because there's a conformity that at a particular point, because of this discourse that OO talked about, how people inherently should do all what they could do or all what they can do or all that is within their reach in order to certainly get some traction or buy-in or score some political point to be called adults in the society. We say at the point where entrenches people, where it arms people and does not partake on people's struggle, then that should not be bought. Secondly, is how over glorification creates a deterministic world. In such world, like we say currently in status quo world, the over glorification and success now entrenches is that discourse that they want is a point where is then a point where people inherently we then tend to live in a world that is deterministic, where people see success as traveling all around the world or taking pictures in aeroplane. We say that is inherently bad because it delegitimize the struggle of the roadside mechanic who inherently sees what he does in order to exchange tires as that which better fulfill inherently. We say at a point where there are society narratives and ideology in principle now, where there are society narrative and ideology that further entrenches certain people's struggle and further widen the gap of who adults and who adults are not, then panel, we think such narrative inherently is harmful and inherently such narrative or ideology should be cancelled. Panel, lastly, what are we going to tell you? We say there's then going to be backlash in certain transition in status quo. We say panel, there are minorities in status quo, which LGBTQ and all. We say at a particular point where there is an over glorification of what adulthood is, the further entrenches rights and certain characteristics for people to come out for who they are. What do I mean by this? We say this narrative of adulthood are mainly conservative in certain background. We concede to the fact that yes, society should impose certain values, but we say at a point where that certain values inherently harm people, then it should not be allowed. So this transition, when people want to transit or come out of who or who they are, since they're coming out from childhood, we say there's already a deterministic of how society should look like, how the LGBTQ or certain people are very bad, or how these persons are they are impaired and hence they cannot have anything to do. So these transitions are very, very difficult for people to come out and hence it is bad. Why do we think we want today's debate? To scale one, OO does not have a case in today's debate because their conversation is taken care of. We've shown you why the impact in terms of time frame and arm. Secondly, we've shown you how over glorification creates a deterministic world. And thirdly, we've shown you why transition is very, very difficult. Proud to come from closing.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech. We now call upon the member of opposition to start off the closing opposition's case.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, sure. So for POIs, you can unmute and ask. So I'll also call you out in my 4th minute so that I'll give the teams chance to ask their POI. But if you feel you have to engage a particular point, you can unmute and ask the POI. That should be only once, please. So I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so basically, the reason why it is called the concept of adulthood is that there are various schools of thought that has contributed to what adulthood in itself is. So at a point in time where CG tries to argue that the glorification in itself, or the problem with government is that they misconstrue the glorification of the concept of adulthood in itself to be societal narratives and ideologies. Even if we agree that that is what the concept or the glorification of the concept of adulthood looks like, we are going to engage them on that particular premise. But again, the reason why it's called a concept is that it has a lot of various schools of thought contributing to what adulthood in itself looks like. So firstly, the concept of adulthood can be biological. That is an individual who have attained sexual maturity. So whether to marry or not, whether to give birth to children, considering your financial capacity or not, is something that is inherent in this particular concept. But then 2, what has been the crux of this debate in itself has been the social aspect of adulthood, whether human adulthood encompasses psychological adult development, something which OO argues broadly but does not impart necessarily. But then thirdly, the concept of adulthood also entails legal adult, i.e. someone who has attained the age of maturity and is therefore regarded as independent, self-sufficient, and responsible. So at a point in time where governments take an aspect of this concept of adulthood and try to paint it as bad, doesn't mean the fact that one aspect of adulthood is problematic necessarily means the entire concept of adulthood is bad. They should engage why biological representation of adulthood is bad. Legal representation of adulthood in itself is something that is very problematic. But what I'm going to respond to is DPM's ridiculous case of how it systematically locks up the youth. Notice, their argument will work if the motion was this house regrets that the youth is the future, because then adulthood as a concept has many contributing factors like biology, social, and your legal constructions. If you are regretting the concept, regret the concept in its entirety and not saying that it gives opportunity for older people to lock up the youth, because being a youth, according to the WHO, begins from age 18 and above, something which feeds into the concept of adulthood. So you cannot argue that the older people lock up the youth, because then the youth in themselves are adulthood. Describe or define why the youth in themselves as adult is something very problematic. That is why OG is going to lose this particular debate. But again, they argue how it looks up like choices and etc is bad. But then notice, inherent in the concept of adulthood is the idea of autonomy. You can't argue that the glorification strips you of your choices, because then society is becoming progressive. That's why most cultures don't force people to give birth or enter into marriages by force, or that's why girls in developing countries these days are going to schools instead of being in the kitchen. We think the concept should be regretted in its entirety and not taking a particular portion of the concept to regret. What I'm going to argue from CO is simple. Firstly, the social construction of adulthood and why the glorification in itself is important. As part of human existence, we need to live in a society that is organized by moral codes. Notice, adulthood in itself becomes an essential criteria of determining our moral codes and why it is worthy, because then adulthood or personhood in itself comes in various degrees. That is why if you're a child, your moral code is different from when you become an adult. Because why? As an adult, your moral code is premised on 5 basic things. Firstly, your consciousness. Secondly, your reasoning. Thirdly, your self-motivated activity. Fourthly, your capacity to communicate. And lastly, your self-awareness. Why then does this glorification in itself becomes important? One, it ensures accountability and culpability mechanisms in the society. Insofar as the concept of adulthood in itself seeks to you should be rational, you should be conscious, you should be self-aware. What it means is that you're able to get you're able to get accountability and culpability mechanism in status quo, insofar as to go contrary to this particular metrics of consciousness, reasoning, etc. You can be held legally accountable for a particular wrong you've done. That is why the concept in itself becomes important. But then second argumentation, right, we think the glorification of the concept of adulthood in itself encourages logical approach to problem. That is what broadly distinguishes the stage of childhood from adulthood. I'm going to take this over OOI because then the glorification encourages critical decision making and critical thinking instead of adults making decisions highly contingent on their emotions. Why is this important? Firstly, it makes rationalization of thoughts and ideas important instead of it being crowded by emotions. But then secondly, you have broad thinking of complex issues like religion, politics, etc. Because then as an adult, your life revolves around these particular areas. It makes you weigh alternative that society is forcing me to marry as an adult, but am I financially stable to enter into the institution of marriage? That is what the glorification of the concept of adulthood does. It makes you question the existence of that particular societal narrative, whether it is in line with sexual maturity or like the biological maturity of adulthood as a concept. The idea of the concept of adulthood enables you to question societal narratives and societal ideologies that exist in the status quo. Any PY or mute and ask.
Yes. See, all of the argumentation, when you talked about that, we concede to the fact that adulthood. See, show us why overglorification is bad. All of the argumentation, because all what you say already in status quo, people know there's a transition stage. Show us why that discourse of overglorification and when it entrenches other people is good.
Why then is the glorification good? Because on the counterfactual, you don't make rational decisions like that, but rather opt in to marry because you don't even prioritize logical approach to problems. So on their counterfactual, on their side, if society is saying, you must marry at the age of 35, because you don't even know what the concept entails, because then the concept of adulthood even makes you question whether the societal narrative in itself is good. That is to say, am I sexually mature to even enter into the institution of marriage? We think that is what the glorification does. It makes you question existing structures that exist in that particular society. On the other side of the house, you don't get that particular question because then they don't even glorify the concept of adulthood. Notice the characterization I gave you as to why the concept of adulthood in itself is good. On biological level, on the societal level, and on the legal level, we think it enables you to question these particular structures that exist. Without the glorification of the concept in itself, people won't take it serious because then there's no accountability mechanism to check even if the adults in the particular society are abreast with issues like politics and etc. The way OG or CG should have won this debate is should have told us that the kind of harm that exists are irreparable because then accountability mechanisms, call-out mechanisms exist in status quo. Society is being progressive. You cannot say adulthood, the concept of adulthood in its blocks you of your choices or makes you structurally disenfranchised. You are proud to win from you.
Thank you, Emma, for that speech. We now call upon the government whip to sum up the government bench's case. Ready when you're ready.
All right, please, can you give me 1 minute to quickly sort out my notes and I'll come back to give my speech very quickly.
Sure. Ready when you're ready.
All right, so panel, I'll be starting right now. So yeah, I'll be starting now. So panel, understand something in this debate, right? The point is, what the entirety of the opposition side in this debate has done basically is to discuss how, oh yes, we have the idea of adulthood and that, because adulthood exists, and there has to be like a glorification basically what they are confusing is the concept of adulthood and the overglorification of that concept, right? Because this is the thing. So very quick rebuttals to CEO, yeah, before I continue. So first thing they talk about is the fact that we have to reject the idea of, adulthood in its entirety. That is the idea of biological features and things like that. We say that this is actually something that is not relevant in this debate, right? Because people would obviously always go through biological changes. And that is exactly not what this debate is about, right? Because the point is this. So what they are trying to say on their own side of the house, and this is exactly why I think CO is probably like even less relevant than OO, right? Because what they say in their own side of the house is this: oh yes, because of the fact that people actually would grow older, right? We should actually subject them to rigors that would actually make their life more miserable, right? Because the point is this: the fact that a human being in itself does not have the autonomy to choose about whether or not to actually grow older, we think that it is actually very sensible and logical to actually spare them of the rigors of the overglorification of adulthood that my partner has actually already shown you in form of, things like present certain expectations, societal standards on them to actually achieve certain things or to be like a particular way. And we think that this is something that is actually not inherently good anyways. So yes, they talk about the second thing they talk about, which is like the bulk of their cases, about the idea of how human beings would actually have logical approaches to problems that exist. We think that this is actually something that is not inherently true, right? Because what we say on our own side of the house is this, right? They talk about the fact that people would actually be able to question the structure. We understand that the idea of logic is actually something that actually comes with growing older. Obviously, like you're seeing the world through like better colored eyeglasses, and this is actually something that basically comes with adulthood. What we say in our side of the house is the fact that society expectation exists is actually what, and this is like something that is caused by glorification, and this is exactly why logicality would not exist anyway, right? Because basically what they say is people would be able to question the structure that exists. We think that this discourse is actually not something that would exist, because this is something that you see that is perpetuated in all spheres of life: social media, society, family, and this is exactly something that my partner already showed you in his speech. So we think that CO is actually grossly irrelevant in today's debate, right? So basically, then let's go to like their opening, right? So opening opposition talks about, the opening opposition actually came to run something about, we need like the idea of promoting narratives of this in society, of promoting adulthood in society and things like that, and also like giving like people a sense of responsibility. We think that this is something that is actually not inherently even correct, and this is why like DPM's response to them is actually something that is very important, right? Because they said like, well, these expectations are things that are normal. What they do on their side of the house is basically trying, like, all the problems they are trying to say they are trying to solve on their own side of the house are actually things that this glorification has already caused, right? Because they say, okay, the idea of like this discourse to actually exist, to actually reduce the problems of adulthood. We think that these are actually problems that the glorification has already caused. Things like actually having like a lot of weight and expectations, societal standards are things that this glorification has already caused. And we think that them saying they are trying to solve it is actually not something that is inherently logical. So what do we bring to you from side CG in this debate, right? Basically, we showed you. Yeah. Okay, so we showed you the arms that exist, right? Because my partner told you, the point is this, right? With the expectation and standard, what you then see is a lot of people now having like a lot of inherent like harms of like maybe the expectation, because they are now forced to like now go out of their way to actually do things that would actually cause like a lot of mental strains on them and their ability and their autonomy, their human dignity in essence, right? We think that this is actually something that is inherently bad for the individual and the society. What you see is a lot of people who now have, okay, yeah, I'll take you later. So what you see is like a lot of things like, like this call-out mechanism that exists in spaces like social media when people do not achieve like certain things at the particular stage of their life. Like when you see people now being like probably people celebrating like milestones in their life, this is exactly something that the glorification actually causes. Now, how does this now affect the individual state of mind? What you then see, and this ties into the case that my partner brought about the idea of determinism that would actually exist, right? Because success will now become deterministic. Certain narratives are actually with the counterfactual that exists in the world is that like certain narratives would now exist that would actually be seen as less valid, because like where you see like maybe people who are actually like very successful and things like that, probably people that are pilots and things like that, their lives will probably be seen as a more mainstream societal standard fitting narratives that would exist, but rather other narratives such as people like the roadside mechanic, people that are probably like less successful in quotes by societal standards would actually now be seen as less important in society. And second thing my partner also tells you is exactly how like a lot of adults would now be seen to like be wanting to partake in things like criminal activities because they want to fit into the society, the ideals of society that has actually been glorified, right? Because basically like these standards are now things that would actually be like perpetuated in society. The third thing my partner also shows you is about how the ideas of like people's creativity and like are actually now stifled by some of the moral characteristics that exist in society. Things like maybe careers like people wanting to become porn stars or people even wanting to become clowns or like an ice cream man are actually now things that are now seen with ridicule and things like that. And we think that this is something that is inherently bad. So now to why do we think we rank above our opening rights? So basically, our opening basically shows you, things about how, individual expressions and things like that. We think that this is actually something that's very important. But what we show you that our opening does not do right is basically how we have been able to show you the idea of how, this glorification would actually, we have been able to show you on impact and it's also on utility, why this over glorification is actually something that is inherently bad. And we think that we have never been prouder to propose.
Izunna, Zuzu, please. I think the chair is not in the room, or am I mixing something up?
Okay, guys. So the chair will be with us shortly, but I would have to stand in for her at this point. So the House calls on the opposition whip to conclude the debate for CEO. Here. CEO.
Yes, Chief Whip here. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Please proceed.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let's recognize how government has failed largely to engage the concept head-on the concept of adulthood as it exists principally. What they have done so far is to engage it in the shade of narrative and ideology that exists among certain societies. And you could hear them relating it to conservative societies and how those things influence what the concept of adulthood is. From side closing opposition exclusively, we tried and we have engaged logically with itself, and by so doing, as of main moral codes, use accountability and culpability to structure our existence and how we live. My speech is going to be simple. I'm going to summarize all the ideas that has happened in today's debate, starting from CG, and then I'll tell you why side-closing opposition wins today's debate. Let's start with CG. So 3 major argumentations we got from CG. They talk about how there exist standards and censorship which infringe on people's actualization, how we live in a world that is premised on determinism, and how there is difficulty in transitions, right? Panel, engagement to that. We think that one, the world which CG presents is a world where there exists no moral code, there exists no standards and censorship. I don't know how that world will look like. They feel likely to show us how that world will look like. But my partner tells you how we are logical beings who have evolved and organized ourselves through structures, through standards, through rights and responsibilities. Censorship standards, they come with some freedom and right that joy, and then on the other hand, things that you enjoy. As let's note how over time people have been able to live within this kind of censorship with the concept of adulthood as holy as it is in principle, and then you have able to prevail, they have been able to actually express themselves in various forms, in art, in music. So it's very problematic for down because of the concept they are culpable, they accept the offenses of certain things that they have done. We think that in instances where we glorify adults, we glorify responsibilities, and then their corresponding rights and freedom, we allow people to begin to, we allow people who are matured enough to reason logically and weigh between the pros and cons and determine for themselves what they want to do with their life. And we think that we allow people to choose to make decisions and all those things in our world. Establishment of childhood and oldhood, and finally on the issue of transition, we think that transition is not difficult. There exists logical avenues of transition within society, i.e. education, i.e. orientation, what have you. We don't think that your biological changes not necessarily allow you to transit very well, right? And as I was transit, and that's that. But there was a PYI that CG asked. The answer is simple. We think that in the context in which we live in a world with increasing defilement of moral codes and accountability, we have no option not to regret anything that ensures and cements the cracks of the breaking wood of our moral structures and our moral codes of conduct and accountability. On any day, we will cement those codes and we ensure the society will continue to evolve, will continue to thrive on that regards. Moving on to OG, right, and some of the biggest cases that we have had so far. But panel recognize that the cases that we brought in today's debate are distinct from our opening, right? We talked about how we engage it on the principle head on. What adulthood concept means, how it is a mechanism that society has used over time to ensure that we unrank people with moral codes, with accountability and culpability. But we think that largely in such a world, we also give people the freedom to choose and the freedom to exist freely, as we have seen over time. right? Because there exists those freedom and the corresponding responsibilities which OG and the whole government claims to be censorship, to be restriction, and to be reduction in people's actualization. To OG's case, they talk about how it reduces people's rights. We think that largely this do not happen. We think that right comes with responsibility, as I've said over and over again, and responsibility lies largely in accountability, large in moral codes, right? Large in our ability to be culpable. For that matter, we enjoy our freedom and our rights that we have. We think that in principle, it is justified for us to enjoy rights, and then on the other hand, give responsibility, give some part of our right to ensure that we all coexist as a society and then we live. But secondly, on another issue that engages OG on their concept of how we reduce people's rights and what have you, we think that, yes, it is a social engineering. We think that it gives room for people to go through the logical stages of life that is presented by nature itself, childhood, adulthood, and then old age. We think that there exist certain avenues and faculties, right, that exist within society to ensure this progressiveness, to ensure this transition, to ensure that people move smoothly between time and what have you. We think that all harms that government presents in today's debates are ones that individuals should bear. Why? Because there exist resources in society that gives this individual the development from one state of nature, that's childhood to adulthood to old age, right? Through the provisions that we give them through adulthood, through childhood, through the protection that we give them. Even if we think that these harms are bad, we think that these harms fall on small number of people, right? People who fail to transit. I've already analyzed you how there is avenue to cater for them. There's protection for these avenues. However, society has always continued to give room and accept individuals who are extremely unique, right? And then they bear these harms. We think that the biggest case that government should have presented is how these harms are irreversible and how these harms, right, go a long way to perpetuate itself. But we think that even in those regards, that biggest case, the responses are that all these harms are not necessarily irreversible. We think that people have strived to glorify, have strived through the glorification over the ages, and then they have proved themselves worth it. However, it is through this glorification of adulthood that have put society and given us the opportunity to evolve logically. As my member analyzed to you, it has created for us a better society with moral codes and accountability and compatibility, as my member has analyzed to you, and therefore we don't think there's any need for us to regret. But finally, panel, the reason why we win is that we engage the issue head on. We have analyzed to you how the concept of adulthood in of itself is something that we cannot regret, something that we should not regret. It's something that has helped society progress through logical avenues of life, and then we have ever been so proud to win from side closing position. Thank you.
Okay, we thank that speaker for that fine speech, and that draws us to the end of this debate. So guys, just be on the Discord channel and the WhatsApp groups, and the chair would notify you guys when OA and rankings will be ready. Thank you very much once again for an engaging debate.
Thank you, George. Chukwu. Well done, everyone. And see, we that did not take POI, thank you so much.